Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're located. My name is Matt Brown. I'm Vice President at AFRY Management Consulting, and today we have another in our webinar series, very interesting and topical subject matter, the Indian power market, a vision for 2030. If we can just skip through the disclaimer slide, put my teeth in, sorry. And onto the next one. And I will just ask our presenters to introduce themselves briefly.
Hello, I'm Stephen Woodhouse. I'm a director with the Oxford office of AFRY Management Consulting. I've led our work on market design for around 20 years.
Hello, good morning. My name is Shweta Jadhav. I'm originally from Mumbai, India, but working in the Oslo office with the Nordic and Baltic markets. I joined AFRY last year, but I have been working in Statkraft in strategic decision making for corporate management, and towards the end of my tenure on business model and strategy development for solar in India. I have a bit of a broad background with an undergrad in IT and a double master's degree in business and economics. And I've worked in sectors of IT, retail, finance in India, Nigeria, and France before I transitioned to the energy sector 6 years ago in Norway. That's me. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, both. And probably I should say also that Stephen is one of our foremost market design experts and does a lot of work in that area, and we'll talk a little bit about market design, I hope, here. Well, I know we will here. So if we skip on to the next slide, just to say we've got about 45 minutes, bit of housekeeping. 45 minutes, about 30 minutes presentation, and we're going to take a little bit longer for Q&A. We have some very good questions come through. Also, please do send questions through during the webinar itself, and also remember that the slide pack and recording will be available and will be emailed. There's a series of webinars, as I say, that we've been doing since March, so on a weekly basis. So do have a look at those on the AFRY website. If you can't find them, just get in touch and we will point you in the right direction. And with that, I will hand over, I think, first of all, to Stephen to take us through the main material. Thank you.
Very good. And just one final piece of housekeeping. There are no fire drills planned, but please could you familiarize yourself with the exit route in case of an emergency. Have to get that bit of conference stuff in because we'll all be lost without it. So the Indian power market. I've worked on the commercial aspects and the design market aspects of power markets for nearly 25 years. Most of that work for the first 15 years or so has been with the European power markets, but increasingly, you know, as energy companies from Europe have been spreading globally, our work as a management consultant has been extending globally as well. So we've offices around the world and all of the continents, basically. My own work has been including market design in the Middle East. We did the spot market design for Oman. We've been looking in depth at China, and we've a team in Beijing there. Recently looking at Taiwan, and a lot of activity there, both on market reform and offshore wind. Just come off a call in Malaysia, looking at the market reforms there. And most recently of all, India. Now, the Indian market is one of the most vibrant energy markets that I've had the fortune to look at. It's at the brink of an absolutely radical transformation towards a low carbon, renewable-led energy system. And although coal is dominant and will continue to play a very major part in the mix, I think the potential changes in the next decade are quite astounding. So let us talk about the structure of this. We're first going to be talking about the physical changes and the outlook for the power mix and the power demand looking forward over the next decade. We will then describe what we've set out as a vision for 2030 for the way that the markets are organized. So Shweta, if I can hand over to you, please, to talk about the situation and how the markets will physically evolve.
Thank you, Stephen. So yes, I will take you through a journey from the past decade, from 2010 to the present day, and then looking forward to 2030 on what are the government's own ambition and targets for the power sector. Yep. The Indian power sector has transformed quite drastically in the past decade. Demand has grown tremendously at 7% annually, and this has been underpinned by village electrification and penetration of electricity access in the rural areas. Demand availability has also increased quite significantly, and energy deficit, both in terms of energy demand as well as peak demand, has reduced quite drastically from 10% in 2010 to just 1% in 2019. The power mix has evolved significantly. A lot of capacity has come online. The share of renewables has also grown in the past decade. A lot of coal capacity coming online, but in renewables, a lot of wind and solar. Solar especially has grown from being non-existent just a decade ago to be having almost a 50% share when it comes to new renewable capacity. And it has been a tremendous success story that has been underpinned by private investment. India has a national regime where the capacity is planned centrally every 5 years, and this has been quite instrumental in improving the energy situation in India, both in terms of capacity, in terms of demand met and deficits reduced. And to enable that, transmission capacity has also improved quite rapidly. Moreover, in 2013, by the end of 2013, India successfully connected its 5 grid regions into a single synchronously connected power system. And today, India is one of the world's largest synchronously connected power systems. All this transition has been enabled a lot by private participation in the sector. The Electricity Act of 2003 has been quite fundamental, not just in liberalizing the markets, but also unbundling and enabling private participation into the sector. As we can see in this chart here, private participation has grown from 18% in 2010 to almost 50% towards the end of financial year 2019. And this has gone in all segments, in all types of capacity, be it non-renewables or renewables. And this has been backed by state government PPAs, which means that a lot of power procurement in India currently happens through long-term or medium-term contracts, PPAs, which are signed mostly with the state-owned distribution companies. As we can see, almost 90% of the power procurement is through these PPAs, whereas the volumes that are traded on spot have been 4%. But nevertheless, India has a very European-style market design when it comes to the trading of wholesale power on the spot market. There is a single countrywide power market, which is available for all the 28 states and 8 union territories. The power market is split into 13 price zones, and it is inspired by the European markets like the Nord Pool spot. There are currently 2 power exchanges that are operating in the wholesale market, and there are 2 more who have applied for licenses. Although spot volumes are quite low, their importance has been growing, and it has grown from a small base of just 34 terawatt hours to 100 terawatt hours. It's not significant, however, if we look at it on an annual growth perspective, it has been 13%, which is a good growth rate. Now, all of this has been happening because of policy and regulatory interventions that have been introduced throughout the decade. As I mentioned, the Electricity Act has been quite fundamental in liberalizing the sector. It also laid the foundations for promoting market development, including trading. In 2004, open access was introduced, which meant that all power consumers over 1 megawatts of power demand are free to choose their power suppliers. This has enabled the PPAs between independent power producers and commercial and industrial actors, mostly power intensive ones. Power exchanges came online in 2008, both of them almost coming online at the same time. Then towards the renewable ambitions and meeting the renewable purchase obligations, renewable energy certificates started trading on the spot market as well. For the industry, there are energy saving certificates available. As renewables started gaining importance, ancillary services mechanisms were being introduced. And towards the end of 2018, there has been a lot of discussion and a lot of discussion papers introduced for the day-ahead market, the real-time market, and redesigning the ancillary services market. More recently, in 2020, the real-time market, which is an hour ahead market, it's an hour ahead rolling market for delivery for 30 minutes time block. It was launched in June 2020, and the volumes on that market are growing quite significantly already. There has been an electricity amendment bill that is introduced in the parliament and up for discussion in January 2020, which is also talking about retail competition, unbundling, and associating different powers to the different actors in the sector. And very recently, just this weekend, the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission released a draft of power market regulations, which are aimed at power exchanges, market participants, and OTC contract holders. So it's not just the physical power market that is changing, but also the market design is continuously adapting to a changing market, and a lot of reforms are underway to improve the efficiency in the market and the liquidity in the market. So where does that take India in 2030? The figures that we see here are the government's own estimates, and it might seem strange to see 2022, 2027, but the current plan is ongoing until 2022, and it has indications towards 2027 as well. In last year, the Central Electricity Authority of India published a paper with suggesting the optimal generation mix until 2030, and that is the capacity that we see for 2030 is from that paper. So as we can see, electricity demand in the next decade will also continue growing at 10% annually in terms of peak demand, but both in terms of peak demand as well as the actual energy requirement will grow. And then to keep pace with that, the installed capacity will also grow by the government's own estimate. And it's quite fascinating to see that renewables, even though they have grown 20% in the past decade, they will still continue to grow 20% in the coming decade by the government's own estimates. And solar is championing the renewables, the new renewable capacity. Coal still is a significant part of the mix. There has been a lot of coal capacity that was constructed in the 60s, in the 80s, that is reaching end of life, and about 23 gigawatts of coal will retire by 2022. However, about 50 gigawatts of coal capacity is under construction currently, and that will come online towards 2030. But when we talk about in terms of renewables, it is mostly led by solar. This takes into account the government ambitions, which were revised very recently, and the government has stated that they are on track towards attaining their ambition of 175 gigawatts of wind and solar. So that's 100 gigawatts of solar, 75 gigawatts of wind, onshore wind, and they revised it to 227 just earlier this year before the in Q1. And all of this renewables, about 60% of the power mix, means that they will bring a growing need for flexibility into the system. As we see here in this graph, the growth in demand and the growth in capacity, there is a lot of overcapacity that is visible. And this is the consequence of central planning, and where the government centrally determines what could be the capacity mix that is required for meeting the demand. And Stephen will explore more on what that means for investments, what that means for market design. However, today, as we saw previously, that a lot of capacity is locked in PPAs, which means that merchant development of generation capacity is almost non-existent. There are no purely merchant power plants operating in India currently, but regulations are upcoming and they are shaping the future of market design to enhance liquidity and efficiency of dispatch, and this will change. But what does the private participation look like in the sector? Today, private participation is present across the entire value chain in the in the power sector, going all the way from generation, transmission, distribution, power markets, as well as retail presence. In the generation, the share of private participation has increased from 18% from 2010 to 46% in 2019. And this is both Indian players as well as international players in renewables as well as non-renewables. When it comes to the transmission sector, I think about 8% of the transmission capacity is privately owned. But when it comes to the transmission and distribution sector, the players are mostly Indian companies, incumbents at that, which are fully vertically integrated power companies present who have generation, transmission, distribution assets, and also present in the retail space. So the transmission, distribution, and retail is predominantly, the market share is predominantly by the Indian companies. When it comes to the distribution sector, there are about 70 distribution companies in India. 40 of them are owned by the state governments, so-called as the state discoms, and the rest are privately owned. Recently, the government has announced that the distribution companies in the union territories will be up for privatization, and they would consider the same model for the distribution companies in other states as well. But that remains to be seen. However, it does appear that the private participation is encouraged across the value chain. When it comes to the power markets, as I mentioned early on, there are two power exchanges currently operating in India. They are both privately owned. There are two more that have applied for licenses. They are also privately owned as per my understanding. And in the retail space, it is a lot of private companies that are currently operating. Again, a lot of them are incumbents who are vertically integrated. Going forward in the future, we do expect that the private sector continues to have a strong presence across the value chain. This is also part of the documented in the government's vision that Stephen will talk more about in the later section. And we see that there is opportunity in all segments in the Indian power sector. And with that, I hand over to you, Stephen, to discuss the vision of the Indian power market.
Shweta, thank you very much. Thank you for that very clear discussion of the issues and setting out the context. So starting with that vision of what the physical system will look like, I'd now like to talk about how the organization of the market could be. So, my role is often as the creator of the market design itself. It's clear that as the market transitions towards dominance by renewable capacity, the nature of the organization, the nature of the trading will have to change quite substantially in the next few years. Now, let me start with the government's own vision. This is for the sector as a whole, and this has some strong echoes of the European Union's clean energy package. So the focus is on things like customer centricity, sustainability, viability, socioeconomic empowerment. And there are some Indian specific issues relating to ease of doing business, ease of living, employment creation. That in Europe, we pretend that industrial policy is separate from energy policy, but it usually isn't. In fact, the Energiewende in Germany and the plan to get 50 gigawatts of solar on the bars by 2020 was actually part of an industrial strategy to get PV manufacturing in Germany. So I think India is probably more clear about the connections between their industrial policy and their energy policy than some other countries. But what you will see is that that electricity is a strategic part of the government of India's overall economic plan. And from that, you might infer that there will continue to be policy intervention in the power sector going forward. Now, our own vision then is looking at the organization of the markets themselves. And we see the following critical issues to be dealt with as we move to a renewables-led system. So the first is renewable grid integration. So accommodating renewables to the market, both technically and commercially. And the buzzword there will be flexibility. The second one relates to the roles. We need to maximize participation, including a whole range of new market players with small scale resources. And we need to ensure that decisions are taken based on the economics of the market as a whole and using increasingly incentives for market participants rather than central control. I think any attempt to control this new diverse mix at this, in the scale of India is doomed to failure. So empowering decentralization rather than centralization, I think, has to be a part of the mix. Investment is critical. We've still got a rapidly growing sector. The need for investment is greater than ever before. So we need to make sure that we get efficient investment, but not just counting megawatts, in the right type of capacity, in the right types of flexibility, and also in the grids to support that ongoing development. And we're already seeing changes in the generation mix. My colleagues on the engineering side are now designing a 1.2 gigawatt pump storage plant, which will be co-located with 2 gigawatts of solar and I think 400 megawatts of wind. So the new wave of technology types is already starting. And the market has to then support those technologies and make sure that the revenues support the right kind of flexibility. And I think customer focus becomes more and more important. We will increasingly see people wanting to have self-generation, maybe their own storage for resilience. Definitely, as you move to greater renewables, you need more and more demand side management to move at least some of the flexible loads to the times when it is windy or sunny. And that becomes an increasingly important part of the overall balance of power. So these are the challenges that the future market design has to accommodate. So let's start with the first of those, renewable grid integration. Flexibility is at the heart of this. So we're looking at building on the existing mechanisms that we have in India, which is a European style balance responsibility model, but we need to enhance the balancing incentives. We need to improve the liquidity in the spot markets, And in particular, we see that, the vast majority of generation is under PPA contracts, and it doesn't come near the market, and that's a big problem. There need to be markets which reward flexibility. There needs to be effective use of the network capacity. And at the moment, congestion isn't a major feature, but it will certainly change over time. As we create liquidity in different marketplaces and different timeframes, we need to have intelligent ways of allocating the network capacity between those marketplaces. And that's a problem we haven't solved very well in Europe yet as well. There needs to be some commercial values for ancillary services, and we need to accommodate new providers of these balancing services, including storage and demand side response and small scale resources. So if you look on the right, that's sort of what we have today, a cascade of forward markets, day ahead, intraday, and we now have an hour ahead market there, and then an economic dispatch model. But we're looking at enhancing that and sharpening up the incentives. We would expect the time frame of the tradable blocks to change, maybe going down to 15 or 5-minute settlement intervals from the current 30 minutes. And there'll be a balance of pricing methodologies between pay as clear where there are auctions and pay as bid where there is continuous trading. And certainly, I've only seen effective integration of renewables where there is a continuous traded market to allow people to trade out changes as the forecasts update, rather than having to wait some hours for the next auction. So continuous markets, for me, are an important part of integrating renewables to the system. And the Commission for Energy Regulation is making its own proposals in this space. Just this weekend, they issued a draft regulation for consultation. And I think it's fair to say that we agree with just about all of the intent, most but not all of the specific recommendations. And I'd be delighted to talk to anybody privately about some of those issues, but I won't dwell on them. I won't dwell on them here. So moving forward, the future power markets have to be financially self-supporting. So there have to be market incentives for investment, and specifically in the right type of technology, not just in megawatts. So we're seeing that the CRC is now discussing a capacity mechanism. Some of those discussions have been on the table for a while, since they first put out some of their discussion papers a couple of years ago on the future form of the market. I think, as we've said, it's important to reward the right type of capacity with an emphasis on flexibility. The second elephant in this room is the interaction between market-led investment and the existing PPA regime. Now, PPAs have been the driver of the wave of investment that has supported the growth in demand over the last decade. They've permitted very substantial private investments in the Indian power sector, both in conventional generation and increasingly in renewables. Nothing should be done to undermine the existing contracts. That goes without saying. But we do need to find ways of exposing at the edges those PPA contracted generation to, effectively to economic dispatch tests. So you shouldn't be running less efficient plants when more efficient plants are available. So we need to find ways of getting flexibility from the existing PPAs without undermining the commercial intent and the commercial sanctity of those PPAs. And, those kinds of transformations have been done in other places. What's more important is that the future wave of PPAs, and we have more than 40 gigawatts of coal plants coming online in the next decade, and it will be expected that those will be under some form of PPAs. We need to make sure that the form of the future PPAs should allow full integration with the spot market. So those are critical issues, and they could be either financial or physical in nature. I don't think that matters, but you certainly need to cover the risks of the generators. But I would like to see in future a migration from a PPA-led investment regime to a market-led investment regime. So looking forward then, we see real diversity in the mix of the generation. The government of India's own vision is described as a sustainable, viable, efficient and competitive power sector, catalyzing economic and social development. And we would very much support the headlines of that. They're complementing that vision with the Electricity Amendment Bill. So the emphasis here is on promotion of renewables, greater private participation in distribution, with a commitment to introduce retail competition. So looking at the government's own plans for what is the most cost-effective mix, which isn't quite what makes up their national plan for 2027, but it's likely to influence it. We're seeing a system with over 500 gigawatts of renewables, which is over 60% of the total capacity. And that's linked with a made in India policy and supported by green energy corridors for the transportation. So there is a coherent package of reforms there. And you will see that those give many, many opportunities for private investment in the power system right throughout the value chain. And you know, the confidence you can take in there being a transparent, well-regulated liquid market, I think will grow. So we see demand growing by 50% by 2030, the needs of customers changing, underpinned by the expected economic growth, new types of electrical demand, including electric vehicles, and there continues to be a Power for All program in India for universal access to electricity, which sadly is not a reality today. So, you know, there will be a lot of focus on improving the circumstances of the power sector in the next decade. We see renewables will cover a complete range of technologies and scale of installations, including, I think, plans for 60 solar cities. And the marketplaces and the formats of trading must match the needs and capabilities of a complete new range of market actors, but also technologies as we move increasingly to storage and micro-scale generation. And flexibility remains the buzzword. So let me just close out by talking about our vision for the power market design. And we do have a more detailed blueprint that we might be able to share with people who are very interested. But we're saying to cover these 4 key issues: renewable grid integration. At the heart of that is effective spot markets to allow efficient dispatch and to allow flexibility to be rewarded in a range of different market timeframes right up to real time. We see the roles have to transform to be a market-led system rather than a centrally controlled system. I think as the mix becomes more diverse and more small scale, that becomes self-evident. Changing the way that investment is promoted, we would like the market incentives to be stronger, and then the opportunity for PPAs and central contracts to take a lesser role in future. As it stands, we've got a significant overcapacity in the generation mix for a variety of reasons, but in the end, it's Indian customers who underpin that overcapacity. It would be good to move towards a market-led environment where it is investors themselves that face the risk of overinvestment in capacity rather than the Indian customers. And we emphasize again the customer focus, encouraging participation from many, many smaller scale actors, including small scale generation and demand side participation, which becomes more and more important in the energy mix looking forward. So just to recap, we see a market with strong growth prospects, a solid regulatory framework, and some very, very promising opportunities for private investors. And we look forward to continuing to support our clients as they look at the Indian market and start making commitments to the Indian market. And at that point, I will stop talking and turn the floor open to questions. So thank you for listening.
Excellent, thank you very much. Fascinating, fascinating subject matter. I'm sure you all agree. And I think it's really interesting in this area, especially of market design. We know there are some advisors out there who come with a sort of one standard market design, which they try and apply to many situations. And what we've seen, I think, Stephen, you'd agree, over the years is what's vital is really to think about the current and future physical fundamentals and the objectives that you're trying to achieve, and design a market from the bottom up, what you need to have. And I think it's again a situation here where we see flexibility and the provision of flexibility being so important, and looking forward an amazing transformation in the Indian power market towards towards renewables. So we have a number of questions that have been sent through. I will start with a fairly broad one. It could cover everything, and maybe Stephen, you take it in the direction you prefer. We have here: what changes do you expect in existing Indian power markets?
Okay, well, in terms of the generation mix, I think Shweta has covered it, but there is some uncertainty as to how we deliver the flexibility. I've even seen a question asking about storage. The IEA issued a report on India a year or so ago, and it had huge storage potential. So I think storage will be a big part of the mix. I think we see increasingly gas generation is likely to be a part of the mix, not for bulk energy, but at least for flexibility. I think the Indian government has a plan to increase gas to be 15% of the overall energy mix of India from something like 6% at the moment. And more and more types of flexibility service have to be there. Now, when we look at the market design, again, I see a migration towards liquidity in spot markets. The day-ahead market is probably the most liquid, but we will have to see some development of ancillary services and some liquidity in the closer to real-time markets. I think on June the 1st, the hour-ahead market, which is termed the real-time market, was launched, and I would expect to see increasing liquidity in those kinds of market timeframes, and more exposure of the PPA contract to generation to the spot markets to make sure that those generators are being dispatched efficiently. So those are the headline changes that I would see, and very big growth in basically all kinds of renewable generation, from rooftop solar, land solar, floating solar, which we're seeing already on. There is a specific question about offshore wind, which I'm not qualified to answer. Shweta, you may want to answer that, or you may choose to duck it. But offshore wind costs are collapsing now in other parts of the world. So I would be fairly sure that it won't be very far away. But Shweta, I don't know if you want to pick up on the offshore wind question or the storage question.
Yeah, I can comment a bit on the offshore wind question. Yes, currently there is no offshore wind in India, but the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy has set some targets for offshore wind, which is 5 gigawatts by 2030. And there are lots of studies being conducted. Just last year, the World Bank Group published a study of estimating offshore wind potential in emerging markets, and India was one of the markets. And they have estimated a potential of about almost 200 gigawatts. That's the technical potential for offshore wind in India. That includes fixed as well as floating. But the problem is with India is that it has very deep coastline. So offshore wind suddenly becomes deep offshore very quickly, and there are very few spots that are available for offshore wind development. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. On that sort of subject, the renewables, what policy initiatives are required for accelerated renewable deployment in India? I don't know who wants to take that one.
I could start on the policy perspective, and then maybe Stephen can pitch in on the market design aspects of it. On the policy side, there have been lots of interventions. The Jawaharlal Solar Mission that was announced in 2005. Then there has been an establishment of SECI, which is Solar Energy Corporation of India, which is the government vehicle for enabling solar auctions and also removing constraints, like making sure that land is available for solar developers. And just so solar in terms of competitive growth is very competitive. Recently, even NTPC had, or SECI's tender was received bids as low as $3 cents per kilowatt hour. That's quite cheap. So in terms of economics, solar is quite good. And in terms of wind policy, I just mentioned that there is a lot of wind is more mature when it comes to installation, and then there could be a new wave of repowering the existing wind. I would stop there on the policy side. Stephen, if you would like to add on the market design aspects of it.
Yeah, and let me add to the market design. So lots of people think that renewable grid integration means protecting renewables from the market, and that can only go so far. It went so far in Germany that all of the PV generation was set to cut out if the frequency reached 50.2 hertz. And nobody seemed to think about what would happen when there was lots of PV generation, and now they're at a high cost. They're now having to retrofit the inverters of PV so that it doesn't all cut out at the same time and cause a blackout across Europe if that happens. So renewable grid integration means thinking ahead to when renewables are a fully functioning part of the market, and making sure that the renewables are fully exposed to the same incentives that everybody else has, and making sure that there is flexible capacity and reward for flexibility. So saying we need a capacity mechanism to get more coal on the system doesn't really help when what you need is more flexible capacity. The government of India is actually having a separate subsidy program to enhance the flexibility of the existing coal assets, because there are no real market incentives to improve flexibility. So we need to make sure that those rewards for flexibility within the ancillary service markets and the real-time markets emerge. We also need to make sure that the grid capacity is available for renewables, and renewables can't commit day ahead. So if you allocate all of your grid capacity to existing long-term PPAs and any residual to the day ahead, you're freezing out the renewables, and you're in danger of the situation in China where the grid capacity is allocated predominantly to the coal on long-term contracts, and then the renewables get curtailed. So access to the grid capacity, including to renewables that only know their output quite close to real time, I think is a really important issue. So it's about making sure that the marketplace rewards flexibility, making sure that those flexible assets are available to balance the renewables. That's as much a part of renewable grid integration and the supporting measures as actually anything you do for the renewables themselves.
Thank you for that. Talking of the coal, and I noticed the 50 gigawatts that you referenced, Shweta, of new coal being built coming on by 2030. Obviously, quite a lot of retirals going on as well, but 50 gigawatts of coal seems like quite a lot. So there's a question here about the role of gas. Many countries adopting natural gas as a bridge towards cleaner energy. What about India? Anything going on there?
I can start on that, and Stephen, you can join in. Gas has had a very limited role in the Indian power mix for various reasons. But primarily it was the fuel allocation to gas power plants that has been inhibiting gas from coming in gas from exploding in India. But also in terms of economics, India has a lot of domestic coal, and coal is cheaper than gas on any given day. But of course, coal is more carbon intensive, so there are pros and cons, and there is no carbon market in India as such. There is an indirect levy on carbon in terms of a coal cess that's applied, but there are many factors that have inhibited gas from coming in, becoming a big part of the power mix. But there are some reforms that are being introduced for the gas sector as well, and it's too premature to comment on what direction the gas sector takes. But India also recently launched its first gas trading platform, so there could be some movement on gas in the future, but it's too soon to tell for now.
And I think this brings us to the point about who decides what generation to build. At the moment, there's virtually no merchant build of generation. Everything is really under long-term PPAs, which cascade down from the government's 5-year plan for the generation mix. And 5 years is a long time. if we move to market-led investment rather than PPA-led investment, you might start seeing people taking slightly different views as things change during the 5-year interval. And I think it's fair to say that if there is the option of a state-backed PPA, it's pretty tough to get merchant generation, which would naturally be higher risk. So the very existence of that PPA market distorts the investment market for generation, investments outside of that. So I think you would see more diversity in the mix if we move to more merchant-led investment. But none of that changes the fact that coal is relatively cheap and gas is relatively expensive in India. But prices for gas can change over time. They can change quite radically.
Thank you both. I think we're pretty much up on time. Maybe just one more question, and then I'll close it out. And I think we could do a webinar without mentioning COVID, sadly. So we had a few questions in that area. I guess the key one is really around the general impact of COVID. How is that going to impact on meeting renewable targets, Government of India meeting renewable targets, or indeed with supply chains being disrupted? Any thoughts on that one?
I can start. Well, the COVID situation has presented a massive challenge globally, and all economies worldwide are reeling from the impacts of COVID, and no one has a clear answer on what's the best thing to do and which direction will a particular economy go into when it comes to COVID. And of course, as with other countries, India is also impacted by COVID, both in terms of the infections rate, but also the secondary effects it has on the economy. So we have seen there has been a long, very strict lockdown period going over several months in India, which has meant that industrial output as well as demand has reduced by almost 20%, had reduced 20% in that strict lockdown period. And that also means that, and because the Indian power sector, the industrial and commercial consumers, they cross-subsidize the residential and the agricultural sectors, it means that the customers who are paying, they're not able to pay their dues to the distribution company. So it has put a lot of stress on the sector as a whole. Of course, there are sectors like manufacturing which are being impacted. And I don't think I'm the most qualified person to answer which direction this will take and what policy interventions are needed to recover from this. But and it's also a bit hard to say, given that it's a global, extraordinary situation.
Thank you. And with that, I think we will. I think we'll close down the webinar. Stephen, I don't know if you've got any last thoughts, last words you'd like to offer.
Well, just a closing one on the practicalities. It's linked to the COVID issue. Customers are not all paying their bills. Many of the discoms are in financial difficulty, and there are some commercial and financial risks associated with the sector. So let's not be totally rosy about the prospects. There are some financial health issues with many of the key companies in the sector, and that will only be worse with the COVID situation. So that's a note of caution, but it will also give opportunities. It's an issue that the regulator and the ministry are actually dealing with now, the financial health of the companies in the sector. But it remains a market with many, many interesting opportunities. It's at the start of some quite radical transformations in the way things are organized, and much of it will be familiar to market players from the European world. We stand by to talk to people about where those opportunities are and how to open them up.
Lovely. Thank you both very much. I hope you found that interesting. If you could just skip on to the next slide, there we have the contact details if you want to chat with Stephen or with Shweta about this or other topics, then feel free to get in touch. And just to say, we are continuing our series of webinars. It says next week here, but Those who are very sharp will see Thursday, the 6th of August is not next week. We're actually having a break next week, and in 2 weeks' time, we'll be talking about the digital transformation, looking at digital use cases in utilities and how you can really make great use of one of the tools that we've put together in understanding your digital use cases. So with that, I'd like to thank Steve and Shweta and Johnny and Bev, who help us put these things together, and we'll leave it there and hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.